So the rest of this reading, as I said, I consider most of it to be a clarification or a defense of the greatest happiness principle. And one of the major issues that Mill means to deal with is people's association with the idea of basing morality on pleasure. They don't think that that's right. Because they think that it's degrading to human nature to say, oh, we're just like animals, we just seek pleasure, and that can't be what morality is about. And Kant, I think, would agree. And Mill is, got to defend. He thinks that the accusation that it's degrading is ridiculous because it's a misunderstanding of what he's getting at. Say, look here on page 3 when he says, "One thus attacked the Epicureans." And Epicurus would be he's an ancient philosopher that Mill would say was a kind of utilitarian, because he said that pleasure was the good, and he said that enjoyment was the purpose of life. When thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light, since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. If this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid. What is the point there? That, well, when we're talking about pleasures, we're talking about human pleasures, first of all. When we talk about happiness, we're talking about promoting human happiness, human enjoyment, human pleasures. And what Mill really wants to get across is the idea that there are many different kinds of pleasure, and some are more important than others. And that he's definitely not just talking about physical pleasures. That's why he mentions swine. He's talking about pigs. If a human being were a pig, then it would just be basically physical pleasures that would constitute human happiness. But much like Aristotle, he believes that there are other forms of activity and pleasure which are higher, supposedly. And this brings us to a very important part, I think, of Mill. Let me just find it real quick. This section here, again, we're not too far in. We're on page 5. Where he says, sorry, where I've lost it. This is in the middle paragraph. He says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, which is a very famous thing that he said. And basically, human nature is complex, and the kind of activities that we engage in are very complex, more complex than any other living creature. Consequently, the types of pleasures that a human being can experience are varied. There are the pleasures of the body. There's the pleasures of eating and drinking. There's the pleasures of sex. There's the pleasures of just the physical pleasure of feeling good, physically, which presumably in some way or another, not in a particularly human way, but in their own way, animals can engage in. But human beings have other pleasures too. The intellectual pleasures, the social pleasures, the moral pleasures. And these demand satisfaction too. That's why he says that it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. That is, it may be that even though the human being has such a complex and profound array of needs and kind of things that they want, that they wouldn't trade that, even if they're dissatisfied much of the time, for the simple existence of a pig, even though the pig's deliriously happy in a pig way, which is, maybe kind of simplifying pig life, actually, because pigs are pretty complex creatures too. But let's just go with Mill's example. Now, the difficulty, of course, is saying, well, okay, I'm saying that pleasure is the good, basically. Anything that promotes pleasure is good. But he's saying, I recognize that there are higher and lower pleasures. There are more important pleasures than the pleasures of the flesh, basically. And then, how do you make that kind of claim, or how do you back up that kind of claim? For instance, he's thinking of the pleasures, intellectual pleasures of things like reading, listening to music, engaging in intellectual activities, engaging in social intercourse, engaging in all sorts of complex activities, and that are not the pleasures of the body, really. And he's saying that those are more important; those are higher, or better, or more valuable pleasures. This is all again in defense of the greatest happiness principle, and saying that happiness is pleasure. Saying that there are higher pleasures. You don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we should live like pigs, even deliriously happy pigs. We have to live like human beings, and human beings are capable of higher pleasures than the pig. And even within the human being, there are higher and lower pleasures. And how do you decide? How do you justify that sort of thing? How do you decide that one pleasure is more pleasurable, basically, than another? And he has an interesting way of responding to that. This is again at the bottom of page 6. From this verdict, the only competent judges, I apprehend, there can be no appeal on a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures. See how he's setting it up? Which is more important? Which is more choice worthy? Which is something that we want more? Which do we consider the more important pleasures? On a question, which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, apart from its moral attributes and from its consequences, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. That is, how would you determine? Well, you would determine it by what people say or choose. And they would have to be people who've experienced both sorts of pleasures. Let's say somebody's experienced the pleasures of eating and the pleasures of listening to Mozart. If you said which is the more worthy pleasure, that person would be able to tell you. Somebody who had never listened to Mozart wouldn't be able to tell you. Somebody who was just familiar with eating wouldn't be able to make the comparison. So he's basing it on a preference. What do people actually prefer? What do they say is a more important pleasure, the deeper pleasure, the more satisfying pleasure? And there needs to be the less hesitation to accept this judgment respecting the quality of pleasures, since there is no other tribunal to be referred to, even on the question of quantity. What means are there of determining which is the acutest of two pains, or the intensest of two pleasurable sensations, except the general suffrage of those who are familiar with both? So what do people say? I mean, what do they prefer? That would determine, basically, which is the deeper pleasure. And he's got an answer. I mean, his answer is people invariably choose the higher pleasures. The person who's comparing the pleasure of eating with the pleasure of listening to Mozart obviously still wants to eat, but would say that there's a level of satisfaction in listening to Mozart that doesn't exist in the level of eating. Somebody who, I don't know, does philosophy, thinks about philosophy, would say, well, there's the pleasure of reading an ordinary thriller or science fiction novel, and then there's a pleasure of thinking through the questions of Plato. And that is a deeper pleasure. So what he's claiming is really an empirical question. Where he's basically saying, people happen to choose these other pleasures and say that they are. He talks about it here on pages 4 and 5. It's here at the bottom of page 4, the last paragraph at least. Now, it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. The higher faculties, the faculties that enable us to listen to great music, to read great books, to engage in complex social interactions with other people. There's the pleasure of dancing with somebody, and then there's the pleasure of forming a long-term friendship with them. Which is more important? Pleasure of dancing with somebody, or the pleasure of engaging in a friendship that lasts years with them. Mill is saying, well, everybody who knows both will say, well, they're both good, but the pleasure of friendship is greater. It's incomparably greater than the pleasure of dancing, let's say. Not that dancing is bad, it's pleasurable. It's just not on the same level. So that's a very important part of his case, this distinction between so-called higher and lower pleasures, and his assertion that people who know both will tell you the so-called higher pleasures really are higher, really are deeper. So that makes us think of the greatest happiness principle maybe in a different way. That is good which promotes happiness. By happiness is meant pleasure, but some pleasures are more important than others. So let's say take somebody like, I don't know, Stephen King, who's widely read and a good writer, but makes no pretense to being serious literature. Let's compare him to Shakespeare, who not only being widely read and a very good writer, touched upon topics which are deeply meaningful to human life. Having read Shakespeare and having read Stephen King, which has afforded you the greater pleasure? I think Mill is saying, well, people who know both are going to choose Shakespeare. It doesn't mean that Stephen King is bad. He is what he is. But Shakespeare that sort of thing. That's the claim here. And I wonder if it's really true or everyone really agrees with it. But it's an incredibly important point, incredibly important defense of the greatest happiness principle.